My name is Natalie, and at 32 years old, I stood in my tiny Columbus apartment holding a lottery ticket worth $97 million, while my phone buzzed with my mother's call. After 20 years of being invisible to my parents, who gave my sister everything, including a mansion while I got nothing but leftovers, Mom was suddenly sobbing about making a terrible mistake. The irony tasted sweeter than any revenge I could have planned. Before I share what happened when I finally answered that call, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If stories about family truths and long-awaited justice resonate with you, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Growing up as the invisible daughter shaped every corner of my childhood in ways that still echo through my memories. When I was 8 years old, my parents took my sister Madison to the Marina restaurant, the fanciest place in town, complete with a 3-tier chocolate cake to celebrate her piano recital, where she'd forgotten half her piece, but still received a participation trophy. That same week, I'd won first place in the district art competition, beating out hundreds of other elementary school students. My certificate ended up crumpled in Dad's briefcase 3 weeks later when he was looking for his phone charger. He smoothed it out and stuck it on the refrigerator without a word right under Madison's participation ribbon, which had been framed in gold. Madison's bedroom looked like something from a teenage dream catalog. She had the entire second-floor east wing of our house complete with a princess-themed canopy bed that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Her walk-in closet was bigger than my entire room, filled with clothes that still had tags on them months after purchase. She had her own private bathroom with a jacuzzi tub and double vanity, where she practiced her makeup tutorials for an Instagram account with 12 followers, mostly family members. The Apple computer on her white vintage desk was supposedly for homework, though I only ever saw her using it to watch reality shows and browse shopping websites. My room was a converted storage space above the garage that my parents claimed had character, because of the slanted ceiling that I hit my head on every morning. The furniture was a collection of hand-me-downs painted different colors in a failed attempt to make them match. I shared a bathroom with guests, which meant whenever my parents had their monthly dinner parties, I had to schedule my showers around strangers needing to freshen up. My desk was a door laid across 2 sawhorses that Dad said would teach me to appreciate nice things when I could afford them myself. Christmas mornings in our house followed a script that never changed. Madison would come downstairs in matching pajamas my mother bought them both every year, while I wore whatever fit from the previous year. The tree would be surrounded by presents wrapped in expensive paper with elaborate bows, each tag reading Madison's name in my mother's careful cursive. She would spend an hour opening gift after gift designer, purses the latest electronics jewelry that she'd lose within weeks, gift cards to stores where a single shirt cost more than my entire wardrobe. My presents were always practical items that my parents said showed they understood my mature nature. School supplies for the upcoming semester, a new backpack when my old one had whole socks and underwear wrapped in newspaper, because wrapping paper was wasteful for necessities. The year I turned 13 stands out as particularly painful. My birthday fell on the same weekend as Madison's cheerleading championship 3 states away. My parents rented an RV, invited Madison's entire squad and their families, and turned it into a 4-day celebration. They left me with Mrs. Chen next door, promising we'd celebrate when they returned. When they came back, Madison's trophy took center stage on the mantel, and my birthday was forgotten entirely until Mrs. Chen brought over a homemade cake 2 weeks later, pretending it was for no special reason while giving my parents a look that could have melted steel. My parents had a phrase they loved to repeat whenever I pointed out the differences in how they treated us. Madison needs more support because she's sensitive, they'd say, while you're so independent and strong. It became their mantra, their excuse for every inequality. Madison got tutors for subjects she was failing because she needed extra help. I was told to figure it out myself because I was smart enough. Madison got therapy when her boyfriend of 2 weeks broke up with her. I was told to stop being dramatic when I cried about having no friends, because everyone saw me as the weird girl whose parents didn't love her. School events became a study in contrasts that everyone noticed except my parents claimed not to see. At Madison's every performance game or presentation, Both my parents would arrive early with flowers, cameras, and embarrassing signs. They'd take hundreds of photos, post them all over social media with captions about their talented daughter, and take her out for ice cream afterward, regardless of how she actually performed. At my science fair, where I won first place in the entire state for my project on renewable energy solutions, the only adult who showed up was Mr. Peterson, the janitor, who felt bad seeing me standing alone next to my display, while other kids had entire cheering sections. The college fund conversation happened 3 days before my 17th birthday. My parents sat me down at the kitchen table with serious expressions, and for a moment I thought they were going to tell me something terrible about our finances. Instead, they explained that they'd saved $180,000 for Madison's education at her dream university where she wanted to study fashion merchandising. When I asked about my college fund, my mother actually looked confused, as if the thought had never occurred to her. "Your grades are good enough for scholarships," she said, "and besides, state schools are more practical for someone like you." Someone like me, I learned, meant someone whose dreams didn't matter enough to invest in. That night I sat in my converted storage room and made a list of every job within walking or biking distance of our house. By the following Monday, I was working 3 jobs while maintaining my straight A average. Mornings at the grocery store, starting at 5, tutoring middle schoolers. After my own classes ended, and babysitting every weekend night while Madison went to parties I wasn't invited to. Every dollar went into a savings account I opened without telling my parents, though they wouldn't have cared anyway. They were too busy driving Madison to social events and buying her appropriate outfits for each occasion. The family portrait incident happened the week of Madison's high school graduation. My parents hired a professional photographer for a session at the Botanical Gardens, spending 3 hours taking hundreds of photos in different locations with different poses. I stood on the edge of every shot wearing the only nice dress I owned that I'd bought from a thrift store with my tutoring money. When the photos came back, my mother gushed over how perfect they were, immediately ordering dozens of copies to send to relatives. It wasn't until I saw the final selections that I realized why she loved them so much. In every single photo they'd chosen to print and frame, I'd been cropped out. The photographer had framed the shots to fit 4 people perfectly, and I was always the 5th standing slightly apart, easy to eliminate. When I confronted my mother, she said the larger frames were too expensive, and besides, everyone knew what I looked like. The years after high school blended into a blur of exhaustion and determination that my family never witnessed. At 22, I moved into my first apartment, a studio in the Riverside district, where police sirens served as my nightly lullaby, and the cockroaches had apparently signed a lease long before I did. The walls were so thin, I could hear my neighbor's entire relationship drama unfold like a soap opera, and the heating only worked when it felt like it, which was almost never during winter. I furnished it with items from garage sales and things people left on curbs, creating what I called shabby chic, but was really just shabby. My parents never visited, claiming they were concerned about safety, though they had no problem driving through the same neighborhood to get to their favorite restaurant on the other side. While I was learning to kill roaches with a rolled-up community college textbook and eating ramen noodles 5 nights a week, Madison was posting Instagram stories from her European graduation trip that my parents funded as a reward for finishing college with a C average. She spent 6 weeks touring France, Italy, and Greece, staying in hotels that cost more per night than my monthly rent. Her posts showed elaborate meals that could have fed me for a month, shopping sprees in boutiques, where a single handbag cost more than my entire year's tuition at community college, and spa treatments, to recover from the exhaustion of spending our parents' money. I worked the night shift at a distribution warehouse, loading trucks from midnight to 8 in the morning, then drove straight to my community college classes that started at 9. The coffee from the vending machine became my lifeline, bitter and burnt, but containing enough caffeine to keep my eyes open through accounting and business management courses. My coworkers at the warehouse were mostly older men who'd been doing the job for decades, and they adopted me like a daughter, sneaking extra sandwiches into my lunch bag when they thought I wasn't looking and covering for me when I dozed off standing up during break time. Madison's downtown condo purchase happened the same month I had to choose between fixing my car's transmission or paying for my final semester's books. My parents called it an investment in Madison's future, though she'd never held a job for longer than 2 weeks and had no income beyond their monthly allowance. They threw a housewarming party that I heard about through Facebook, where distant relatives I hadn't seen in years toured the 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The kitchen had marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that Madison would never use, preferring takeout and meal delivery services that my parents also paid for. When I finally saved enough to fix my car 3 months later, I discovered they'd actually spent $450,000 on Madison's condo, not the $150,000 they'd told everyone. My community college graduation day arrived with the kind of bitter irony that had become my life's theme song. I'd worked for 3 years to earn my associate degree, maintaining a perfect GPA while working full-time and surviving on 4 hours of sleep. The ceremony was small, held in the college gymnasium that smelled like decades of teenage sweat and broken dreams. I'd sent my parents an invitation 3 weeks in advance, even offered to save them seats in the front row where they could actually see me receive my diploma. That morning, my mother called to say they couldn't make it because Madison had scheduled an emergency wisdom tooth removal and needed emotional support. Madison's wisdom teeth had been removed 2 years earlier, something they'd apparently forgotten, but I didn't bother reminding them. Getting my teaching degree required another level of sacrifice that tested every ounce of determination I possessed. Online classes meant staying up until 3 in the morning after my warehouse shift, completing assignments on a laptop that crashed if I opened more than 2 browser tabs at once. Student teaching meant working for free during the day, while still needing to pay rent, so I picked up weekend shifts at a 24-hour diner where the tips barely covered gas money, but the manager let me take home leftover food that would have been thrown away. My car became a symbol of the gulf between Madison's life and mine. While she received a new BMW for successfully staying smoke-free for a year, which was particularly ironic since she'd never smoked in her life, I nursed along a 15-year-old Honda that required a prayer and a specific jiggling of the key to start. The check engine light had been on so long I considered it a feature rather than a warning. When the transmission finally gave out completely, I spent 3 months taking 3 different buses to get to work, a journey that turned my 30-minute car commute into a 2-hour odyssey each way. Madison posted complaints about her BMW's heated seats, not warming up fast enough while I stood at bus stops in freezing rain. Jake entered my life during that bus riding period, a fellow teacher who offered me rides home and eventually became my first serious relationship. He came from a close-knit family who had Sunday dinners together and celebrated everyone's achievements equally, no matter how small. The first time he witnessed how my family treated me was at a restaurant where we'd accidentally run into my parents and Madison having dinner. They invited us to join them, then spent the entire meal discussing Madison's latest business idea while I might as well have been invisible. Jake watched in bewilderment as they ordered dessert to celebrate Madison, thinking about maybe possibly considering starting a food blog, while ignoring my mention of being nominated for Teacher of the Year. That night, Jake held me while I cried and asked why I maintained contact with them. I couldn't explain this desperate hope that one day they'd really see me, and realize what they'd been missing. The relationship lasted 8 months before Jake gave me an ultimatum that wasn't really an ultimatum at all. He couldn't understand why I kept returning to the source of my pain, why I showed up for holidays where I was treated like an unwelcome guest, why I still answered their calls when they only reached out needing something from me. He wanted me to choose between them and him, not realizing I'd never actually had them to choose. When he left, my mother's only comment was that I should have tried harder to keep him happy, while Madison posted about how some people just aren't meant for real love. The health scare at 26 taught me exactly where I stood in my family's priorities. I collapsed at school during a parent-teacher conference, my body finally rebelling against years of stress, poor nutrition, and sleep deprivation. The hospital kept me for 3 days running tests and pumping me full of fluids while lecturing about burnout and self-care, as if those were luxuries I could afford. I texted my parents from the emergency room, hoping for once they'd show up, sit by my bedside, bring me flowers, or even just a card. They sent back a single text saying they hoped I felt better soon, but couldn't visit because Madison had caught the flu and needed homemade soup and round-the-clock care. My fellow teacher Grace brought me clean clothes and sat with me during visiting hours holding my hand, while I pretended my parents' absence didn't shatter what was left of my heart. Grace became the family I chose, or rather who chose me when my biological family wouldn't. She was 15 years older, had raised 3 kids mostly alone after her husband died, and recognized the look of someone trying to pour from an empty cup. She started bringing extra lunch, claiming she'd made too much, though I knew she was cooking specifically for me. She listened to me vent about my parents without trying to fix it or make excuses for them. She celebrated my small victories like they were Olympic medals, throwing me a party. When I successfully taught a struggling student to read at grade level, something my parents didn't even acknowledge when I told them. My students became my purpose, especially the ones who reminded me of myself at their age. The quiet ones who sat in the back, who flinched when called on, who never had anyone attend their school plays or science fairs. I made sure to show up for every event to display their artwork prominently to remember their birthdays with handmade cards. One student, Marcus, wrote in his end-of-year essay that I was the first adult who ever made him feel like he mattered. That essay sits framed on my desk next to absolutely nothing from my parents. Thanksgiving of my 29th year stands out as the moment I finally understood nothing would ever change. I drove 8 hours through a snowstorm to make it to my parents' house, bringing homemade pies I'd spent 2 days preparing because my mother always complained that store-bought desserts had no soul. When I arrived, I found they'd already eaten dinner 3 hours earlier because Madison's new boyfriend preferred to eat at 4 instead of 7. They were all sitting in the living room watching football plates pushed aside, not even having saved me a plate. My mother suggested I could make myself a sandwich with the leftovers if I was hungry from my drive. I sat alone at the kitchen table eating dry turkey and cold mashed potatoes, while listening to them laugh at the game, and something inside me finally broke in a way that felt like freedom. Mrs. Chen next door had watched my relationship with my parents deteriorate since I was young, offering silent support through cookies left on our doorstep and invitations to join her family for dim sum. After that Thanksgiving, I started accepting her invitations, learning to make dumplings, while she taught me Mandarin curse words to mutter under my breath when my family disappointed me yet again. Her kitchen became my sanctuary, filled with the warmth my childhood home never provided. She taught me that family recipes weren't just about food, but about passing down love through generations, something my mother never bothered to do with me, claiming Madison was the one who'd carry on traditions. Jennifer, the single mom living in the apartment below mine, became another thread in the family quilt I was stitching together from found pieces. We started sharing Sunday dinners, taking turns cooking while our students' homework covered every available surface. Her daughter Lily started calling me Aunt Natalie, and I taught her to read using the same patience I wished someone had shown me. Jennifer never asked about my biological family, but she made sure I had somewhere to go on holidays, someone to call when I got good news, and a shoulder to cry on when the weight of being unwanted became too heavy to carry alone. The final attempt at connection with my parents happened on their 35th wedding anniversary. I spent months creating a photo album, hunting down pictures from relatives, scanning old photographs, writing memories next to each image. I included photos of myself they might have forgotten about, proof that I'd existed in their lives, even if only on the periphery. The album was leather-bound, each page carefully designed, a labor of love that cost me more in emotional energy than money. I wrapped it in silver paper with a bow made from the ribbon my mother had saved from Madison's first dance recital, thinking the sentimentality might touch something in them. I found the album 3 weeks later during a visit, still wrapped, thrown in the garbage bin in their garage. The silver paper was stained with coffee grounds, the bow crushed beneath empty takeout containers from Madison's favorite restaurant. They hadn't even opened it to see what was inside. When I confronted my mother, she looked confused and said she thought it was just another book I was trying to get them to read, as if my attempts to share my life with them were an inconvenience to be discarded. That night, I retrieved the album from the trash, cleaned off the coffee stains, and gave it to Mrs. Chen, who cried over every page and hung my childhood pictures in her living room next to photos of her own grandchildren. Tuesday started like every other exhausting day in my life as an underpaid, overworked elementary school teacher. The parent-teacher conferences had run 3 hours over schedule, because Mrs. Morrison needed to discuss every single aspect of her son's performance, despite him being one of my best students who required absolutely no intervention. My feet ached in the sensible flats I'd worn for 2 years past their expiration date, and my head pounded from smiling, while parents complained that their children deserved better grades for minimal effort. The October rain had soaked through my jacket during lunch duty, leaving me damp and shivering through the afternoon meetings. I stopped at Kumar's corner store on my way home, the same place I'd been buying my single lottery ticket every Tuesday for the past 5 years. Mr. Kumar greeted me with his usual warmth, already reaching for the Mega Million slip before I'd even reached the counter. His store was cramped but immaculate, smelling of cardamom and the fresh samosas his wife made every morning that I sometimes splurged on when I had an extra $5. The numbers I played never changed a combination that would seem random to anyone else but held deep meaning for me. 3, 7, 15, 23, 31, and 42. Each number represented a student who'd changed my life in some way. 3 for Marcus, who was student number 3 on my first-class roster, and taught me that sometimes the loudest children are the ones hurting the most. 7 for Aisha, born on July 7th, who showed me that brilliance comes in packages that standardized tests can't measure. 15 for Tommy, 15 years old when he came back to visit, and tell me that my class was the reason he hadn't given up on school. 23 for the entire class from room 23, who pooled their allowance to buy me a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest teacher," but meant it with love. 31 for the number of thank you letters I'd received from former students over the years, each one saved in a box that was worth more than any inheritance. 42 for Lucy, student 42 in my current class, who reminded me daily why I chose this profession despite everything. Mr. Kumar always joked about my unwavering numbers, saying one day they'd make me rich, and I'd forget all about his little store. I'd laugh and promise that when I won, he'd be the first to know, and I'd still come in for his wife's samosas. It had become our ritual, this exchange of impossible dreams and promises we never expected to keep. That Tuesday was no different, except for the way he paused before handing me my ticket and said that he had a feeling about this week. I tucked the ticket into my wallet between my expired insurance card and a photo of my students from last year's field day, not giving it another thought. Wednesday morning arrived with my ancient alarm clock's jarring buzz at 5:30. I made my usual coffee in the machine I'd bought at a yard sale, which required a precise combination of hitting the side and pressing the button twice to work. While waiting for it to brew, I opened my laptop to check the winning numbers more out of habit than hope. The lottery website loaded slowly on my outdated computer, the numbers appearing one by one like a slow revelation. 3, 7, 15, 23, 31, 42. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the linoleum floor and spreading dark liquid across the lesson plans I'd spread out the night before. I didn't move to clean it up, couldn't move at all, just stared at the screen while my brain tried to process what my eyes were seeing. I refreshed the page 17 times, convinced it was a glitch, a mistake, a cruel joke by the universe that had already played so many. But the numbers remained unchanged, staring back at me with impossible certainty. My hands shook as I retrieved the ticket from my wallet, checking each number against the screen like a prayer I was afraid to believe in. When they all matched, when I'd verified it beyond any doubt, I sat on my kitchen floor next to the spreading coffee puddle and laughed until I cried, then cried until I couldn't breathe. $97 million. The jackpot that had been building for weeks because no one had won. And now it was mine, chosen by 6 students who'd taught me that sometimes the most unexpected people can change your life. The next 48 hours required a level of acting I didn't know I possessed. I called in sick Wednesday, the first sick day I'd taken in 3 years, claiming food poisoning that Mr. Kumar's samosas definitely didn't cause. I spent the day on the phone with the lottery office, my voice barely working, as nice professionals explained the process in terms that sounded like a foreign language. Lump sum or annuity tax implications, publicity requirements, claim procedures. I took notes in handwriting that looked nothing like my usual neat teacher's script, my hands still shaking with disbelief. Thursday, I returned to school because my students had a test, and I'd promised we'd review their creative writing assignments. I taught lessons on autopilot, smiled at my usual times, responded to emails about next week's bake sale that I'd never attend. During lunch, I met with a financial advisor in a coffee shop downtown, a woman recommended by the lottery office who specialized in sudden wealth syndrome, which was apparently a real thing that people like me experienced. She looked at my worn shoes and patched teacher bag and spoke slowly, gently, like I might spook and run. We discussed trusts and LLCs, investment strategies, and tax shelters, a life I'd never imagined needing to understand. Grace noticed something was different when I didn't complain about the cafeteria serving mystery meat again or roll my eyes at the principal's third motivational email of the week. I told her I was just tired, and she made me promise to take care of myself, not knowing I was about to be able to do exactly that for the first time in my life. She hugged me before leaving that day, and I held on a little longer than usual, memorizing the feeling of someone who cared about me before the money who'd loved me when I had nothing to offer but friendship. Friday afternoon, I signed the papers that would change everything. The financial advisor had helped me set up an LLC called Forgotten Dreams, a name that made the lottery officials raise their eyebrows, but that I refused to change. After taxes, the lump sum came to $49 million, a number that still didn't feel real even as I watched it appear in an account with my name on it. The advisor suggested keeping the win quiet as long as possible, but in a small city like Columbus, secrets had a way of sprouting wings. By Saturday evening, a local news station had somehow gotten wind of the story. They ran a segment about the local teacher who'd won Big Complete with a photo from my school's website, where I looked tired, but smiling, surrounded by my students' artwork. Within hours, my phone began buzzing with notifications I'd never received before. Facebook friend requests from people I'd never met, Instagram followers, multiplying by the hundreds. Text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, congratulating me on my good fortune. Sunday brought the reactions I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. My coworkers ranged from genuinely thrilled to suddenly remembering how we'd always been close friends despite never speaking outside of mandatory meetings. The principal called to congratulate me and casually mentioned the school's budget shortfalls, as if I hadn't been buying supplies with my own money for years while he drove a Mercedes. My students' parents began reaching out, some with investment opportunities, others with sob stories that might have worked if I hadn't heard them explain their European vacations during conferences. Jake, the ex-boyfriend, who'd left because he couldn't understand my family dynamics, sent a long text about how he'd been thinking about me lately and realized he'd made a mistake. The text included 12 heart emojis and a suggestion that we get coffee to catch up. I deleted it without responding, but not before screenshotting it to show Grace, who laughed so hard she nearly choked on her lunch. She said it was better than a soap opera watching everyone suddenly remember I existed. The distant relatives came crawling out of woodwork I didn't know existed. Cousins I hadn't heard from since childhood suddenly remembered our close bond and wanted to reconnect. An aunt who'd excluded me from her daughter's wedding guest list because of venue limitations now wanted to plan a family reunion. They all had different approaches, but the same underlying message that I was family and family takes care of each other, conveniently forgetting how they'd never taken care of me. My students, in their innocent wisdom, had the purest reactions. They wanted to know if I'd buy a mansion with a pool they could swim in, if I'd get a pet tiger, if I'd still be their teacher. When I told them I'd finish the school year because I'd made them a promise, one little girl named Sophie hugged my legs and said she was glad because rich people on TV were mean and she didn't want me to change. I promised her that money couldn't change who someone really was. It just made them more of what they already were. The most painful silence came from my immediate family. For 12 hours after the news broke, my phone remained quiet of their particular ringtones. No missed calls from my mother. No texts from my father. Nothing from Madison. They were processing, I knew, trying to figure out how to approach the daughter and sister they'd spent 2 decades ignoring. I could picture them huddled in their living room, the one where family photos lined the mantel with me cropped out, strategizing how to handle this unexpected development. Madison broke first, her text arriving at hour 13 with characteristic self-absorption. Her message read simply, "Is this actually real?" followed by 3 skeptical emojis and a link to the news article, as if I might not know about my own lottery win. No congratulations, no excitement for my life-changing moment, just doubt that someone like me could have something extraordinary happen. I didn't respond, but I did note that she'd viewed my Instagram story 7 times, studying the confirmation post I'd made, like it might reveal some trick. I spent Sunday evening with Mrs. Chen, who cried when I told her the news, and immediately started praying to her ancestors to protect me from the evil eyes of jealous people. She made me promise not to forget where I came from, not to let the money change my heart, and to be careful of people who would now see me as an ATM rather than a person. She fed me soup and wisdom in equal measure, reminding me that I'd been rich in spirit long before I had money, and that was the wealth that truly mattered. Jennifer and Lily came over with a cake they'd made from a box mix, lopsided and covered in too much frosting, with "Congratulations, Aunt Natalie" written in shaky letters. Lily had drawn $signs all around the edge with green icing, and Jennifer apologized for the mess, but it was the most beautiful cake I'd ever seen. We sat on my threadbare couch, eating straight from the pan, while Jennifer worried about me being taken advantage of, and Lily asked if being rich meant I wouldn't help her with homework anymore. Grace arrived with wine and tissues, knowing I'd need both. She let me cry about how unfair it was, that money was what it took for people to notice me, how I'd spent years being worthy of attention and receiving none. She reminded me that I now had the power to never need their validation again, that I could build a life so beautiful they'd regret every moment they'd wasted not knowing me. She also made me promise to hire security, because she'd watched enough true crime shows to know that lottery winners became targets. By Monday morning, I had 314 missed calls, 641 text messages, and more emails than I could count. My social media had exploded with mentions and tags from people claiming to know me, sharing stories about our friendship that existed only in their imagination. Someone had even started a GoFundMe claiming to be raising money for my favorite charity, though I'd never heard of the organization, and certainly hadn't authorized anything. The vultures were circling, and my family still hadn't made their move. I went to school Monday because routine felt like the only solid ground in a world that had suddenly shifted. I taught my lessons, graded papers, and attended a staff meeting where everyone stared at me like I might start throwing money in the air. The principal asked if I'd consider funding new computers for the school right there in front of everyone, and I responded that I'd consider it, when he considered why teachers had been buying their own supplies for years, while the football team got new uniforms annually. The silence from my parents lasted until Monday afternoon, exactly 52 hours after the news broke. I knew they'd been strategizing, planning their approach, deciding how to play this. The delay told me everything about their calculations, how they'd weighed their options, and decided on the best angle to take. They'd probably consulted Madison's therapist, the one they paid $300 an hour, to validate Madison's every feeling while telling me therapy was for people who couldn't handle their own problems. I spent Monday evening with the financial advisor setting up automatic deposits to several charities, creating education funds for students whose families couldn't afford college, and establishing an anonymous scholarship for kids from difficult family situations. I also set aside money for Mr. Peterson, the janitor, who'd been the only adult at my science fair, though I'd have to find a way to give it to him that his pride could accept. The advisor kept reminding me to take care of myself too, but taking care of others felt like taking care of the part of me that had been hurt. The news coverage expanded beyond local stations. My story had all the elements media loved: a struggling teacher family drama implied by their absence from my life, and a massive jackpot that represented every working person's dream. Reporters called the school, showed up at my apartment building, and tried to interview my neighbors. Mrs. Chen told them all to go away in Mandarin and English, protecting my privacy with the fierceness of a woman who understood that some invasions couldn't be undone. I started looking at houses online, not mansions, but places with doors that locked properly and heat that worked when you needed it. Places with enough room for a real desk and bookshelves filled with all the books I'd wanted to buy but couldn't afford. A kitchen where I could cook real meals instead of surviving on ramen and whatever was on sale. A garden where I could grow things, create life instead of just surviving it. The possibilities felt overwhelming and liberating in equal measure. The lottery office had warned me about the publicity that would come with claiming the prize, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of becoming public property. Everyone had opinions about what I should do with the money, how I should invest it, who I should help, who I should cut off. The same people who'd never noticed my struggles were now experts on my success, offering advice they weren't qualified to give about a situation they'd never experienced. But between the chaos and intrusions, beautiful things happened too. Former students reached out to tell me how I'd impacted their lives, sharing success stories I'd never known about. Parents who'd been difficult during conferences sent apologies, finally understanding how much I'd done with so little. Teachers from other schools messaged about how my win gave them hope that good things could happen to good people. The positive messages didn't erase the negative ones, but they reminded me why I'd chosen education despite everything. Tuesday morning arrived exactly 1 week after I'd bought the winning ticket. Mr. Kumar had kept the store closed Monday to avoid reporters, but he opened Tuesday just for me, letting me in through the back door with tears streaming down his face. He hugged me like a father would, telling me he'd prayed for this moment since the day he met me and saw how hard I worked for so little reward. His wife had made special samosas just for me, filled with extra love and pride for the teacher, who never forgot to ask about their grandchildren. I gave Mr. Kumar a check that would let him renovate his store and finally take the vacation to India he'd been postponing for 15 years. He tried to refuse, but I reminded him of all the times he'd snuck extra items into my bag when he thought I wasn't looking, all the mornings he'd had coffee ready when I was running late, all the moments he'd been kind when the world wasn't. He cried harder and promised to name a sandwich after me, which made me laugh because his sandwiches were terrible, but I'd eat one anyway. The $49 million in my account felt surreal, like numbers on a screen that couldn't possibly represent real money. But the reality hit when I paid off my student loans with a single click, watching years of debt disappear like they'd never existed. I paid off my car, then realized I could buy a new one that didn't require prayer to start. I could shop for groceries without calculating the total in my head, could buy the good shampoo instead of the dollar store brand, could fill my gas tank all the way, instead of putting in just enough to get to work. But I didn't go crazy with spending like everyone expected. Years of poverty had trained me too well to suddenly become frivolous. Instead, I made careful plans, thoughtful decisions about how to use this money to fix not just my life, but the systemic problems I'd witnessed. I started a foundation for teachers to get classroom supplies without spending their own money. I created a fund for students whose parents couldn't afford field trips. I established a program for kids who needed breakfast and lunch during summer breaks when school meals weren't available. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 20 years begging for scraps of attention from my family, and now that I had something they wanted, they would finally see me. But it was too late for their recognition to heal those wounds. The money had simply revealed what had always been true, that they only valued people for what they could provide, and I'd never had anything they wanted until now. Saturday morning at 6 a.m., my phone rang with the specific ringtone I'd assigned to my mother years ago, a classical piece that sounded sophisticated but empty, just like her affection. I'd been awake for an hour already, sitting at my kitchen table with Grace, who'd stayed over to be my emotional support, when the inevitable call came. We'd made coffee and placed bets on which manipulation tactic would come first: tears, guilt, or sudden recovered memories of loving moments that never happened. The sobbing started before I even said hello, theatrical wails that could have won an Oscar if they'd been more convincing. My mother gasped my name between sobs, like she was in physical pain, though I'd heard her cry exactly twice in my entire life, once when her favorite restaurant closed, and once when Madison scratched her BMW. These tears were different, calculated, and performed, designed to trigger the empathy she knew I possessed but had never valued. Through the speaker I'd immediately put on so Grace could witness this, my mother kept repeating the same phrase between dramatic gasps for air. "We made a terrible mistake, Natalie. Such a terrible mistake." The words might have meant something if they'd come 20 years earlier, or even 5 years earlier, or really any time before a lottery ticket made me worth noticing. Grace rolled her eyes and poured more coffee while my mother continued her performance. In the background, I could hear my father coaching her in harsh whispers. "Tell her about the photo albums," he said, not quite far enough from the phone. My mother immediately launched into a story about secret photo albums she'd been keeping of my achievements, hidden treasures of my childhood, that she looked at when she missed me. It was such an obvious lie that Grace nearly spit out her coffee. The woman who'd thrown away my handmade anniversary gift was now claiming to have secret shrines to my memory. My mother's voice shifted to nostalgic as she began manufacturing memories that never existed. She claimed she'd always known I was special, destined for greatness, that she'd told all her friends how proud she was of her independent daughter. This was the same woman who'd introduced Madison as her daughter and me as Madison's sister at social events, who told people I was doing fine when they asked about me, never mentioning my achievements or struggles, because she didn't know about them. The birthday lie came next, an elaborate fiction about how they'd celebrated my birthdays privately, just the two of them toasting to their remarkable daughter, who was too mature for childish parties. She spun a tale about special dinners at home, where they'd talk about my future, my potential, my strength. The reality was that they'd forgotten my birthday more often than they'd remembered it, and when they did remember, it was with a card from the gas station and a $20 bill that felt more like an afterthought than a gift. Christmas became another fantasy in her revision of history. According to her new narrative, the practical gifts were carefully chosen because they knew I valued useful things over frivolous ones. She claimed they'd spent hours selecting the perfect backpack, the most comfortable socks, the highest quality school supplies. The truth was that my gifts were usually purchased at the last minute from whatever store was still open on Christmas Eve, wrapped in newspaper, because they'd used all the nice paper on Madison's presents. The college fund explanation was perhaps the most creative fiction. My mother claimed they'd wanted to teach me independence, to show me I could achieve anything on my own, that they'd watched with pride as I worked multiple jobs and earned scholarships. She said they'd secretly put aside money for me that they'd planned to give me as a surprise after graduation, but somehow that surprise had never materialized. The trust fund they'd supposedly created had mysteriously vanished, probably around the same time Madison needed a new car, or another semester paid for. My father finally took the phone, his voice shifting into what I called his business mode, the tone he used when negotiating contracts or dealing with difficult clients. He talked about family financial planning and protecting wealth using terms he'd learned from the financial advisors they'd clearly consulted before making this call. He spoke about tax strategies and investment opportunities, family trusts, and estate planning, as if I hadn't already hired my own team of professionals who actually had my best interests at heart. Then came the slip that revealed everything. While explaining why Madison needed help, my father accidentally mentioned the real cost of her condo, $450,000, not the $150,000 they'd always claimed. He tried to backtrack to explain it away as including renovation costs, but the truth was out. They'd spent 3 times what they'd told everyone on Madison's housing, while telling me that state schools were more practical for someone like me. The health manipulation started when emotional appeals weren't working. My mother suddenly remembered that her health hadn't been good lately, that the stress of our estrangement was killing her. She listed symptoms that sounded copied from a medical website: chest pains and shortness of breath that only occurred when she thought about how she'd failed as a mother. The timing was remarkable, developing these serious health concerns exactly when I had money that could pay for the best doctors. Madison joined the call without announcement, her fake crying even less convincing than my mother's. She started talking about how much she'd missed her sister, how empty her life had been without me, how she'd always looked up to me. This was the same Madison who'd posted on social media about being an only child when it suited her, who'd told anyone who asked that we weren't close because I was jealous of her success. Her tears dried up quickly when she started talking about her debt, which was apparently substantial and somehow my problem to solve. The coordination between them was obvious, like watching a bad play, where the actors kept forgetting their lines. They took turns hitting different emotional points, passing the phone between them like a baton in the world's most manipulative relay race. My mother would cry. My father would talk business. Madison would plead sisterly love, then back to my mother with health concerns. They'd rehearsed this, probably spent hours planning their strategy, assigning roles and emotional beats. The nursing home threat felt particularly cruel, a weapon they'd saved for when other tactics weren't working. My mother wondered aloud who would take care of them in their old age, if not their daughters, painting a picture of lonely decline that might have worked if they hadn't spent 2 decades showing me exactly how little family meant to them. They had plenty of money for their own care, having spent my college fund and inheritance on Madison, but suddenly they were worried about dying alone. My father revealed that Madison's business ventures had failed spectacularly, something they'd hidden from everyone, including their friends. The fashion blog had lasted 3 posts before she got bored. The boutique they'd funded had closed within 6 months because Madison didn't understand that running a business required actually showing up. The consulting firm she'd started with their money had never had a single client. They'd poured hundreds of thousands into Madison's dreams while telling me that struggle built character. The coordination extended to their friends and extended family, who'd all mysteriously decided to reach out that same morning. My phone buzzed with texts from aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years, all mentioning how concerned they were about the family rift, how important it was to stay together. The timing was too perfect, the messages too similar. My parents had mobilized their entire network, calling in favors and spreading their version of events where they were loving parents trying to reconnect with a stubborn daughter. Grandma became a weapon they wielded from beyond the grave, claiming her dying wish had been for the family to stay together. This was the grandmother who'd actually left me an equal inheritance that my parents had given to Madison, telling me there must have been a mistake in the will. They'd stolen my grandmother's love even in death, and now they were using her memory to manipulate me into forgetting 20 years of neglect. My mother's tears stopped instantly when I started speaking, proving they'd been as real as Madison's concern for my well-being. The silence on the other end was complete, all 3 of them waiting to hear if their performance had worked, if they'd broken through my defenses and secured access to the fortune they felt entitled to. I could picture them huddled around the phone in their living room, the same room where my childhood pictures had been replaced with additional photos of Madison. The guilt escalated when they realized I wasn't immediately folding. They brought up every relative who would be disappointed, every family friend who would judge me for abandoning my parents, every societal expectation about family obligation. They painted me as selfish and cruel, the daughter who got lucky and forgot where she came from, even though they'd never let me forget that I came from a family that didn't want me. My father made legal threats wrapped in concern, mentioning that lottery winnings could be contested by family members who'd provided support during the winner's life. It was laughable considering they'd provided nothing but emotional damage, but the threat was clear. They were willing to take this to court to air our family dysfunction publicly if it meant getting access to my money. The same people who cared so much about appearances were ready to destroy them for a percentage of my winnings. Madison's mask slipped completely near the end, frustration replacing her fake tears. She accused me of always being jealous of her, of finally having something that made me special and lording it over the family. The projection was so complete, it was almost impressive. She'd spent her entire life lording her favored status over me, and now that the tables had turned, she couldn't handle it. Her entitlement came through clear as she demanded to know why I thought I deserved all that money when I'd never achieved anything before. The final manipulation was a promise of public apology, as if humiliation could erase decades of neglect. My mother offered to tell everyone how wrong they'd been, to make a social media post acknowledging their failures, to throw a party celebrating me. The fact that they thought public performance could fix private pain showed how little they understood about the damage they'd done. They were offering to pretend to love me in public, which was somehow worse than honestly not loving me in private. The smile that spread across my face as I listened to their final desperate attempts was something Grace later described as terrifying in its calmness. I'd spent 3 days preparing for this call with my therapist, with Mrs. Chen, who taught me that sometimes the best response to manipulation is simple truth delivered without emotion. I'd written pages of notes, documented 20 years of neglect, and practiced my responses until I could deliver them without my voice shaking. The recording app on my phone captured everything, creating evidence I hoped I'd never need, but suspected I would. Instead of addressing their emotions or manipulation tactics, I responded with the phrase I'd practiced 100 times. I hear your words. Not I understand. Not I forgive not. I accept just acknowledgement that they'd spoken without validating what they'd said. The silence that followed was deafening as they processed that their emotional performance hadn't achieved the intended result. I could hear them scrambling, whispering to each other about what to try next. From the folder Grace had helped me compile over the past 3 days, I pulled out the first document and email my mother had sent to my aunt 5 years ago. My voice remained steady as I read it aloud. Natalie doesn't need us hovering. She prefers her independence. And honestly, it's easier for everyone this way. Madison requires so much more attention. The email continued with complaints about having to attend my college graduation, how inconvenient the timing was, how they'd rather have spent the weekend at Madison's beach house. My mother tried to interrupt to explain, but I kept reading. The itemized list came next 20 pages of documented favoritism that Grace had helped me organize with the precision of a legal brief. Every birthday they'd missed or forgotten while celebrating Madison's half-birthdays. Every school event they'd skipped while attending Madison's rehearsals for plays she quit before opening night. Every dollar spent on Madison's wants, while I worked 3 jobs for my needs. The total came to over $800,000, not including the condo, the cars, the trips, the spending money that flowed to Madison like water while I rationed ramen noodles. I read them the text messages they'd sent each other in their family group chat, the one they'd created without including me. Madison had accidentally shown me years ago, not realizing I could see the chat name Family-1. The messages revealed their true feelings, complaints about having to invite me to Christmas, jokes about my shabby apartment, mockery of my teaching career. Madison had written that at least Natalie's low expectations meant she'd never be disappointed, and my mother had responded with laughing emojis. The social media evidence felt particularly damning as I scrolled through years of posts where I'd been systematically erased. Family vacation photos where I'd been cropped out or simply not invited. Celebrations of Madison's every minor achievement, while my Teacher of the Year award went unmentioned. Status updates about being proud parents of their daughter, singular, as if I didn't exist. The Christmas card from 3 years ago that said the Richardson family with a photo of the 3 of them sent to relatives who asked if I'd died. The restaurant receipt from Giuseppe's hit them the hardest because they couldn't deny it. I'd saved it after finding it in my father's jacket when I'd visited, hoping he might want to celebrate my teaching award. The date matched exactly with the night I'd been in the emergency room alone and terrified, texting them for support. The receipt showed champagne, expensive wine, a 5-course meal for 3 to celebrate Madison's decision to maybe think about possibly starting another business that would inevitably fail. They'd toasted her potential while I lay in a hospital bed, wondering if I was dying. I pulled up the trust fund documentation that my grandmother's lawyer had accidentally sent to me, instead of them revealing that she'd left equal amounts to both grandchildren. The money designated for me had been moved to Madison's account within weeks of Grandma's death, with a notation that I'd agreed to forfeit my share. I'd never agreed to anything, had never even been told there was an inheritance to forfeit. They'd stolen not just money, but my grandmother's final gesture of love. The recording of Madison from cousin Rachel's wedding 3 years ago was particularly devastating. Rachel had sent it to me afterward, horrified by what she'd captured. Madison's drunk voice rang clear through the phone speaker, laughing about how I was the charity case of the family, how pathetic it was that I still tried to impress our parents, how she could ask for anything and get it while I couldn't even get them to remember my birthday. She'd called me a useful reminder of what failure looked like, and everyone at the table had laughed. Their lies began unraveling in real time as I presented evidence that contradicted every claim they'd made. The secret photo albums my mother claimed to keep didn't exist, which became obvious when she couldn't name a single specific photo when I asked. The private birthday celebrations were fiction proven by their credit card statements that showed no purchases on any of my birthdays. The college fund they'd supposedly saved for me was a fantasy, their financial records showing every penny going to Madison's education and lifestyle. My mother's fake tears stopped completely when I started reading the email she'd sent to their financial advisor 6 months ago, discussing how to restructure Madison's trust fund to give her more access to money. In the same email, she'd mentioned that I was doing fine on my own and wouldn't need any financial support, that I'd inherited my father's independence and Madison had inherited her sensitivity. The advisor had recommended family therapy, which my mother had dismissed as unnecessary since there were no real problems. I revealed that I'd already updated my will before they'd called, excluding all of them completely. The money would go to education foundations, to students who reminded me of myself, to teachers buying supplies with their own money, to janitors who showed up for lonely kids at science fairs. Every penny would go to people who deserved support, who'd been overlooked and undervalued, who needed someone to see their worth. My family would receive exactly what they'd given me: nothing. My prepared statement came next, written with my lawyer's help to be legally clear and emotionally final. Any future contact would need to be in writing through my attorney. Any attempt at direct contact would be considered harassment. Any public statements about me would be met with legal action for defamation. Any claims on my lottery winnings would be fought with the full force of my legal team and the evidence I'd compiled. I was offering them a clean break, the chance to walk away with their dignity, if not their integrity. The power shift was audible in their silence, the dawning realization that I held all the cards and they had nothing to bargain with. Their attempts at manipulation had failed, their threats were empty, their emotional appeals had fallen on ears deafened by years of neglect. They'd trained me too well to survive without them, and now I was thriving without them, beyond their reach and control. The daughter they'd ignored had become the woman they couldn't influence. My father tried one last business approach, suggesting that family wealth should be managed together for tax purposes. I informed him that my financial team had already structured everything perfectly legally, that I'd pay every penny of taxes owed, and that his expertise wasn't needed or wanted. His voice cracked when he realized I'd hired better advisors than he'd ever been, that I'd learned to protect myself from people like him, that his little girl had become successful without his guidance or support. Madison's final outburst revealed everything about her character. When she screamed that I'd always been jealous of her, that winning the lottery didn't make me special, that I was still the same pathetic little sister begging for attention. I let her rant, recording every word as she destroyed any sympathy anyone might have had for her. She revealed her debts, her failures, her complete dependence on our parents' money, her inability to function as an adult, despite having every advantage. She was everything they'd created, a monument to their enabling and favoritism. My final words to them were carefully chosen, practiced until I could say them without emotion. I thanked them for teaching me to be independent, for showing me that I could survive without love, for proving that family was about choice, not blood. I told them their neglect had made me strong enough to help children who felt invisible, to recognize pain in others because I'd lived it myself. I said I forgave them, not for their sake, but for mine, because carrying anger toward people who didn't matter was wasteful. Then I said goodbye and hung up while they were still sputtering responses. The months following that phone call unfolded like a flower finally finding sunlight after growing in shadows. I didn't quit teaching immediately despite everyone's assumptions, instead finishing the school year with my students who'd been with me since September. They deserved consistency, deserved someone who kept promises, deserved to know that money didn't change fundamental commitments. Every morning I still arrived early to set up my classroom. Still bought supplies with my own money, though now I could afford the good markers. Still sat with the lonely kids at lunch who reminded me of my younger self. Setting up the Forgotten Dreams Foundation took 3 months of paperwork and planning with lawyers who specialized in educational nonprofits. The mission was simple but comprehensive: to support children who fell through cracks in family systems, who achieved despite neglect, who needed one adult to see them clearly. The first scholarship went to Marcus, my former student, who'd written that I was the first adult to make him feel visible. He was starting college to become a teacher, wanting to be for others what I'd been for him, and I made sure he'd graduate debt-free. My house search ended when I found a modest 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street with a garden that misses. Chen immediately declared perfect for vegetables and a kitchen that could host our cooking lessons. It wasn't a mansion like Madison's condo didn't have marble countertops or floor-to-ceiling windows, but it had warmth in its bones and room for chosen family to gather. The spare bedrooms became havens for students who needed emergency housing for Jennifer when her apartment flooded for Grace when she just needed friend time. Mrs. Chen was my first official dinner guest, crying as she helped me cook in a kitchen that had all the tools we'd dreamed about while making dumplings on my broken stovetop. She brought photos of her grandchildren to hang on my refrigerator, declaring that family was about who claimed you, not who birthed you. We established Thursday night dinners that grew to include Jennifer and Lily Grace and her children Mr. Peterson, who'd retired, but still checked on his kids and rotating students who needed a meal that came with love. The educational supply warehouse I created started as a room in an abandoned school building, but grew to serve 3 districts within 6 months. Teachers could come and take whatever they needed, no questions asked, no forms to fill out, no justification required. The joy on their faces when they realized they could have the good construction paper, the markers that didn't dry out, the books that weren't falling apart, reminded me why I'd stayed in education despite everything. We served over 300 teachers in the first year, affecting thousands of students whose learning no longer depended on their teachers' personal finances. Madison's public escalation began 2 months after I'd cut contact with a tearful Instagram video about her cruel sister, who'd abandoned family after winning the lottery. The comments section became a battlefield of people who knew our real story versus strangers she'd manipulated. Former classmates shared stories of how she'd bullied kids whose parents couldn't afford designer clothes. Teachers commented about parent conferences where my parents only showed up for Madison. The truth came out in waves that no amount of damage control could stop. Security became necessary when Madison started showing up at my school with photographers trying to stage reconciliation scenes for social media. She'd appear with flowers and tears calling out about missing her sister while recording everything for content. The school had to ban her from property, get a restraining order when she wouldn't stop involve police when she tried to sneak into a school play. Her desperation was performative but also dangerous, escalating as her parents' money ran out and her debts accumulated. My parents tried a different approach through lawyers claiming emotional distress and alienation of affection, suggesting that my lottery win had created mental instability that caused me to cut off loving family. The case was laughed out of preliminary hearings when I presented my evidence folders 20 years of documentation that showed a clear pattern of neglect and favoritism. Their lawyer actually apologized to me afterwards, saying he'd had no idea what the real situation was, that he'd been told a completely different story. The scholarship program expanded to include 17 students in its first year, all kids who'd been overlooked in their families but excelled despite it. Their essays made me cry every time stories of younger siblings whose older siblings got everything of kids whose parents forgot their birthdays, but remembered the dogs of teenagers working night shifts to pay for college while their siblings got free rides. Each scholarship was full ride plus living expenses, plus a mentorship with someone who understood their specific struggle. Dating Thomas started unexpectedly at a foundation fundraiser where he was representing his company's charitable giving program. He knew my story from the media, but asked about my teaching instead, wanted to hear about my students rather than my lottery win. Our first date was coffee that turned into dinner that turned into walking until 2 a.m., talking about everything except money. He'd grown up with parents who loved equally, but struggled financially, the opposite of my experience, but somehow complementary to it. The wedding invitation from Madison for her 4th marriage came addressed to Natalie Richardson and guest, as if we were acquaintances rather than sisters. The theme was Great Gatsby because, of course, it was all excess and show with no substance underneath. I sent a beautiful card declining attendance, but made an anonymous donation to a charity in her name, one that helped people with shopping addictions and financial literacy. The thank you note from the charity got sent to her address, a petty move that Grace fully supported. Mr. Peterson tracked me down through the school district to thank me for the Janitor Appreciation Fund I'd started in his honor. He cried when I told him about the science fair, how his presence had meant everything to a little girl whose parents couldn't be bothered. He'd kept the picture from that day, my project, and my proud smile despite standing alone, had it in his wallet for 15 years. He became a grandfather figure to my students, teaching them that every job had dignity and every person deserved respect. The therapy journey with Dr. Williams went deeper than just processing family trauma, exploring how neglect had shaped my entire worldview and relationship patterns. We worked through survivor's guilt about having money when others struggled through the imposter syndrome that suggested I didn't deserve success, through the deep belief that love had to be earned through exhaustion. Healing wasn't linear. Some days I still reached for my phone to call my mother, but each month the urge weakened. 3 years after the lottery win, I was teaching part-time at the community college while running the foundation full-time. My students were future teachers, learning not just curriculum, but how to see invisible children, how to be the adult who shows up, how to create classrooms where every child matters equally. The program had a waiting list, full scholarships for everyone accepted, and a placement rate of 98% in schools that needed these specially trained teachers most. Madison reached out privately through a mutual acquaintance, not directly but testing waters for reconciliation. Her message was different this time, admitting she'd been jealous of my independence, my ability to survive without our parents' money, my genuine relationships with people who loved me without transaction. She was in therapy, she said, working through her own issues with our family dynamic. I didn't respond, but I didn't block the messenger either, leaving a door cracked for a future that might include honest conversation. The birthday milestone of 35 was celebrated with 50 people who'd become my family through choice and chance. Mrs. Chen made dumplings for everyone, while Grace decorated with photos from our years of friendship. Jennifer and Lily performed a song they'd written about chosen families, and Mr. Peterson gave a speech about guardian angels in unexpected places. My students past and present filled the garden, and Thomas held my hand while I ugly cried at the love surrounding me. Not one biological family member was missed. The letter from a parent of one of my scholarship recipients broke me in the best way. She wrote about watching her daughter transform from invisible to invincible, from forgotten to unforgettable, because someone had finally seen her worth. The daughter was graduating valedictorian, heading to medical school, planning to work in underserved communities. The mother said I'd saved not just her daughter, but their entire family's future, breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. 5 years have passed since that Tuesday, when 6 numbers changed my life, though the winning ticket was really just permission to become who I'd always been without apology. The foundation now operates in 12 states, has provided over 300 full scholarships and supplies 10,000 teachers annually with materials they shouldn't have to buy themselves. The statistics matter, but the individual stories matter more. Each child who discovers they're valuable, despite their family's inability to see it. Each teacher who can focus on teaching instead of spending their grocery money on classroom supplies. My mother's recent letter sits unopened on my desk, arrived through my lawyer with a return address from a seniors community in Florida where they moved after selling the family home. Grace thinks I should burn it unopened, Jennifer suggests. Reading it might bring closure. Mrs. Chen says I'll know when I'm ready to decide. The weight of it doesn't hurt anymore, just exists as evidence that some people only learn to value what they've lost after it's gone forever. Maybe one day I'll read it, maybe I'll throw it away. Maybe it doesn't matter what words it contains, because they can't rewrite history. Madison's 5th marriage announcement came through social media, tagged by a cousin who thought I should know. She looked tired in the engagement photos, the kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly performing happiness rather than feeling it. Her fiancé was another wealthy older man who'd probably been attracted to the facade our parents had funded for so long. I felt something that might have been pity, understanding finally that being the golden child had been its own kind of prison, just with prettier bars than mine. The therapy breakthrough came last month when Dr. Williams asked what I would tell 8-year-old me standing alone at that science fair. I realized I'd tell her that Mr. Peterson's presence mattered more than our parents' absence, that one person seeing you clearly outweighs 100 who look through you, that families aren't always found in blood, but in the choice to show up repeatedly. I'd tell her she was already enough, already worthy, already loved by people she hadn't met yet, who would recognize her light despite the shadows others cast. Understanding my parents' limitations brought more peace than anger ever could. They were people broken by their own histories, whatever made them capable of loving only one child, incapable of seeing the damage their favoritism caused. Maybe Madison had reminded them of themselves in ways I never could. Maybe they'd projected their own needs onto her while seeing my independence as rejection. The reasons stopped mattering when I realized their inability to love me equally was about their lack, not mine. The students I work with now through the foundation recognize me as one of them before I even share my story. They see it in how I notice the kids sitting alone, how I remember names others forget, how I celebrate small victories like their Olympic medals, because I know what it costs to achieve anything when you're starting from emotional deficit. When they ask how I survived, I tell them about choosing myself when no one else would, about building family from strangers who became essential, about discovering that sometimes rejection is protection from people who would diminish your light. Thomas and I married last spring in Mrs. Chen's backyard garden with 30 guests who'd earned their places through years of showing up. My students served as flower girls and ring bearers. Grace was my maid of honor, and Mr. Peterson walked me down the aisle with tears streaming down his weathered face. The ceremony was simple, but profound promises made between two people who'd learned that love wasn't supposed to be earned through exhaustion, but given freely to those who prove themselves worthy through consistent care. We're expecting our first child in 3 months, a daughter who'll grow up surrounded by the family we've built, rather than the one I was born into. She'll know her Grandma Chen, who's already knitting blankets, her Aunt Grace, who's planning educational toys, her Uncle Peterson, who's building a rocking chair in his garage. She'll have cousins and my former students who'll teach her that family extends beyond blood, that love multiplies when given freely, that worth isn't determined by comparison to others. The scholarship recipients stay in touch through a private group where they support each other through college and beyond. They're becoming doctors and teachers, social workers and engineers, artists and entrepreneurs, all carrying forward the lesson that neglect doesn't define potential. Several have started their own foundations, their own scholarship programs, their own ways of reaching back to pull others forward. The ripple effects extend beyond what I could have imagined when I stood in my apartment holding that winning ticket. Speaking engagements at education conferences. Let me share what I've learned about recognizing and supporting invisible children in classroom settings. Teachers cry when I describe the signs: the child who never asks for help, because they've learned not to expect it; the one who hoards school supplies, because they don't know when they'll get more; the student whose perfect grades mask a desperate need for someone to notice they exist. The strategies are simple, but require intentionality that many overwhelmed teachers struggle to maintain without support. The wealth hasn't corrupted me the way my family predicted in their angry emails to relatives trying to paint me as changed by money into someone cruel and unrecognizable. Instead, it revealed that I'd always been generous, had always wanted to help, had always seen others' pain clearly, because I'd lived my own so thoroughly. The money just gave me resources to act on instincts that poverty had limited. Every dollar spent on others feels like reclaiming power from people who'd convinced me I deserved nothing. Grace pointed out recently that I won 2 lotteries first, the obvious $97 million one, but more importantly, the lottery of finding people who chose to love me when my biological family couldn't. Mrs. Chen teaching me to cook with love, Jennifer sharing single motherhood struggles over cheap wine, Grace holding my hand through every rejection and celebration, Mr. Peterson showing up when no one else would. These people were my real jackpot, worth more than any amount of money, though the money certainly helped me show them how much they'd meant. Sometimes I drive past my childhood home, now sold to a young family with 2 children who play equally in the yard. The storage room above the garage has been converted into a proper bedroom with real windows and heating that works. The new parents pick up both children from school, attend both sets of events, have 2 sets of photos on their social media. It's healing to see the house hold what it couldn't when I lived there, proof that buildings aren't inherently cruel, just the people who inhabit them. The community center I'm building will open next year, a place for kids who need somewhere to go after school that isn't an empty house or a home where they're unwanted. It'll have tutoring and hot meals, art supplies, and music rooms. counselors who understand family trauma, and adults who see every child as equally valuable. The plans include a science fair space named after Mr. Peterson, an art room for first-place winners whose certificates might otherwise end up crumbled in briefcases, a quiet corner for kids who need to escape into books that show them different possibilities. My story went viral again last week when someone posted a then and now photo me at 8, standing alone at the science fair beside me at 37, surrounded by scholarship recipients at their graduation. The comments section became a battlefield of people sharing their own stories of family neglect and chosen families of golden children and forgotten ones of lottery wins that had nothing to do with money. The thread grew to thousands of responses, a chorus of voices saying, "Me too. I understand you're not alone." The final reflection on this journey is that winning the lottery didn't give me worth it, revealed worth that had always existed but been ignored by those who should have seen it first. Every child deserves parents who distribute love equally, who celebrate all achievements, who remember all birthdays, who see all their children clearly. When that doesn't happen, when families fail at their basic function, the forgotten children have two choices. Let the neglect define them, or use it as fuel to become something extraordinary. I chose the second path, and $97 million just made the journey more comfortable. To anyone watching who recognizes themselves in my story, who's been cropped out of family photos literally or metaphorically, who's worked 3 jobs while siblings got free rides, who's been told they're too independent to need love, know this truth that took me 37 years to fully understand. Your worth was never determined by your family's ability to see it. You were always the lottery, the jackpot, the prize. Some people are just too blind to play the right numbers, and their loss is not your burden to carry. Thank you for listening to my story, for being part of this journey that started with a lottery ticket, but was really about learning that the biggest gamble is choosing yourself when no one else will. If this resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that they're valuable, despite being treated as worthless. Like this video if you believe in chosen families and second chances. Subscribe if you want to follow more stories of people who turned pain into purpose. And comment below with your own story of becoming visible, because every voice matters, every story counts, every forgotten child deserves to be remembered. Remember, sometimes the family that finds you is worth infinitely more than the one that forgot you, and no amount of money can buy what freely given love provides. You are always worth everything. Some people just can't count that high.